Alrighty. So our first speaker for the second half of the morning is Daren Carlson. Daren has been the monitoring coordinator for the non-game wildlife program for the DNR since 2008. He has a master's degree in conservation biology from the University of Minnesota. Likes to spend his free time birding, hiking with family, and traveling, especially to Slovakia, is in my notes, gardening and working on house projects. So, Daren.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. Really fun to see some familiar faces and new faces as well. And I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about this prairie monitoring project, which is going on 17 years. And when I stop and say, has it really been that long? And then I remember that my oldest daughter, was born in 2007 when we first started setting up this project, and she's going to college next year. So it must be real. Time does pass rather quickly. So I'm going to start with a little bit of context. Todd did a great job already talking about some of these issues, but just to remind ourselves about the status of prairie in Minnesota, back at the time of European settlement, we had about 18 million acres covering about a third of the state of Minnesota. Today we have less than 2%. So the yellow that you see on the map, that was the original prairie. The red is what remains today. Most of that prairie a lot of that prairie is protected, not all, and we're still losing some of our native prairie across the state. And of that remaining prairie, there's also a lot of pressure that's degrading those prairies from invasive species, pesticide and herbicide drift into these areas, and a host of other factors. Todd talked a little bit about the need for prairie restoration, and we have made some strides in prairie restoration. But there's still definitely a lot of work to be done, as we've seen in some of the grassland bird trends that was shown earlier this morning. And Todd had already talked about this, the 2019 project. Basically, I'll just quickly say that grassland birds, that's the habitat where we're seeing the greatest decline since 1970. And also a companion study that came out, or a follow-up study talking about state of the birds, or a study called State of the Birds, came out in 2022, identified tipping point grassland species, those species that have declined over 50% in the last 50 years and are expected to decline another 50% in the next 50 years. There are 6 Minnesota grassland bird species that meet that category. We've actually essentially lost 3 of those already: the Baird sparrow, chestnut-collared longspur, and Sprague's pipit essentially do not breed anymore in Minnesota. So 3 of the 6 we've already lost in Minnesota. So why monitor prairies? If it's sounding so dire, are we just documenting the decline? And one thing I would say is, actually we have a responsibility to document that decline. If no one does, if we don't do it, who will? But I also take a more hopeful approach to monitoring, and just want to make sure you can see the white. Yep, that looks good. I really think of using monitoring information, it's using information in the past to be more effective into the future. And we can do this at the broad scale of status and trends, like the breeding bird survey, also more site level, where we're doing projects, looking to see how effective have we been in our restoration projects or the management that we're doing. So really, it's just a way to identify. It's kind of like vital signs when you go into the doctor. What's the vital signs of our habitats? And what's in sync, what's out of sync, to help us identify what future actions or additional information or research that we may need to take in order to try and correct something that is a bad sign. So we started this monitoring project, as I said, started working on it back in 2007, and it was shortly after we had finished the first State Wildlife Action Plan, which is a plan that is centered around what are called species in greatest conservation need, rare, declining, or vulnerable species. And every state in the United States, all 50 states, had to develop this plan in 2005 to receive federal funding for these species in greatest conservation need. Minnesota, that's equated to about $1.2 million for these species. These plans have to be updated every 10 years, so we're actually on our 3rd iteration. 2 of my colleagues are we're working very doing a lot of work these days updating the plan for the next iteration, 2025 to 2035 plan. But back in 2005, we had identified 292 wildlife species in greatest conservation need. That included mammals, birds, as well as some insects and mollusks, so it was both vertebrates and invertebrates. And how prairie came out as having the most of those 292 species in greatest conservation need were associated with prairie, almost 120 out of the 292. And at the time, and Lee Fanmueller I see is here, and she was my fearless leader at the time when we were developing this plan, and we were talking about we should get some monitoring going, and really we don't have a lot of monitoring projects going in the prairie. So this is really was the impetus for us starting this. So we said, how do we want to structure this monitoring project? We had a few workshops of prairie-minded professionals get together and talk about all the pressures that prairies face, and we ultimately settled on two main drivers of change that sort of impact other pressures on the prairies, one of which is habitat fragmentation. Since we've lost so much prairie, the prairies that remain are often in small, isolated parcels surrounded by or separated by agriculture or roads or cities. And that leads to another set of pressures on our prairies because of these isolated habitats that have very little interior space. We often talk about interior forest, but there's also a concept of interior prairie, far away from roads and where predators that are more wide-ranging and generalists can get into that interior space. When something is more small and fragmented, easier for a predator to get in. So that was one of our main drivers. The second main driver of change we wanted to structure this project around is climate change. And I'll be honest that back in 2007, when we had these workshops, it didn't get a lot of votes. Because even today, it still seems like too big of an issue to even wrap your head around. But there's a few forward-thinking people that said, if we don't start monitoring or structuring our projects around climate change and thinking about climate change now, when will we? We need to, this is now the time to do it. And I'm glad they did. Because climate change has a whole host of other issues that can impact our, not just prairies, but all of our habitats. One example, phenology, timing of insect emergence and bird migration. You know, if there's a mismatch in that timing when insects come out, or for pollinators and when plants bloom, and for a pollinator species that's dependent on that flower, that timing may be off because of the changes in the climate. And a whole host, this is an example. So those were our two main drivers of change that we were looking at: habitat fragmentation and climate change. So how did we structure that? For fragmentation, we decided to look at site size and landscape context, and we put the sites that we selected into two bins. Small and isolated sites, this on the left side, these maps are the same scale. Beautiful Butternut Valley Prairie south of New Ulm, 12 acres in size, actually an amazing prairie, for plants at least. Not a lot in the way of birds, I'll be honest. But it is surrounded by agriculture, row crop agriculture, as far as the eye can see. And then in the other bin of sites, we had large sites that were embedded more in a matrix of open habitat. Maybe not necessarily native prairie, but it could be restored grassland or pasture land, or even open wetlands. Just anything that's sort of, if you think about a bird as it's flying across the landscape, it's cueing on these landscape variables and says, oh, that looks like a good place to land. And this is Ordway Prairie in west central Minnesota. It's several hundred acres in size, but even really, if you think about 18 million acres to what we have today, it's still not a very large prairie, but it's the largest that we have, and one of the largest we have in Minnesota. And then for climate change, we structured the sites, or we selected the sites along the latitudinal gradient of all the prairie region in western Minnesota, from the Canadian border down to the Iowa border, spanning about 500 miles, that distance from north to south, to see if we could tease out differences in, as climate changes, differences in that climate from north to south. And we selected 5 zones that represented concentrations of remaining native prairie. And those zones are, not only do they span this latitudinal gradient, there are some differences in topography and soil types and other environmental conditions. So within a zone, those sites are more similar to each other than between zones. So pulling this all together for the study design, we selected 40 high-quality, permanently protected prairie. These are like the best of the best that we have in Minnesota. And there's 8 sites in each of those 5 geographic zones, and then 4 each of those 8 sites, there's 4 of those small isolated sites and 4 of the large embedded sites. So we can compare both across those zones and in between the landscape context, so kind of both the climate change and the habitat fragmentation questions, those drivers of change. Of those 40 sites, it would be great if we could monitor them every year, but we just don't have the financial or even people capacity to sustain that, doing 40 sites every year. So we developed a split panel design where 10 sites are sampled every year. 4 of those sites are sampled every year, 4 of the same sites. So we get some sense of annual variation. And then the remaining 36 sites are on a 6-year rotation. So we visit those sites every six years, a different 6, every year. And so every 6 years, different 6 every year, sorry. So it takes 6 years to go through all 40 of those sites. In addition to monitoring birds, we also monitor vegetation, as well as recently we started monitoring pollinators, and we're still working out the details. But right now we're monitoring butterflies. We had started with bees, but we had to go back to the drawing board with bees. And I also just wanted to highlight that in this picture is myself on the lower right, Bob Dunlap there, and then Mike Warland, who's a non-game wildlife specialist in the southern region of Minnesota. We have been pretty much the consistent collectors of the bird information for the last 4 years. And I looked back at the data just recently, and we've collected 75% of all of the points that we've done over the 17 years. So there's we're a pretty consistent set of the 3 of us that have collected a lot of the information to reduce some of that variability. And so how do we collect the information? Standard 10-minute point counts. These are the locations of the points were randomly generated at the beginning of the study. They stay fixed. So we walk out there to the point, stand there for 10 minutes, recording all bird species seen or more likely heard, as well as the number of individuals, the sex, we estimate the distance in 4 distance categories and record any breeding evidence. And this is actual track that I did one time out in Chippewa Prairie, because sometimes I feel like when I'm trying to get to a point, I have my head down looking at the GPS unit, and I'm wandering around in circles trying to get to that location, and I feel like I must look like a crazy person if somebody watching me from the side. But actually, there is a bit of wandering, but we do ultimately get the job done in the end. So how am I doing on time here? So, some results. And so the advantage, or sort of the complementary aspect of this study to the breeding bird survey results that Todd had talked a lot about in the first presentation, is that these sites are, in our best quality prairies, permanently protected, and we're going into the interior of those prairies. And so we wanted to see how that compares to the roadside surveys, which are crossing habitats of various quality, habitats that may come and go over time. Some land might be in conservation reserve program, and then somebody decides to convert it back to agricultural lands. So wondering, are those really high quality protected sites, are the birds doing better in those? And I'm gonna step through some of the individual birds, but I also, just this graph, the black is what I call, and I forgot to mention it, the name of the project is called SPICE. I'm going to refer to that in some of these graphs. Sustaining prairies in a changing environment is what it stands for, but SPICE for short. And then we looked at the breeding bird survey results in 3 different ways that I'll explain in the next couple of slides. But just the general patterns you'll see is that there's quite a bit of similarity between the black and the light gray from the breeding bird survey results, with some differences here and there, but generally they do match. So the breeding bird survey was already explained by Todd earlier. It's roadside surveys every half mile, and so I'm going to move on from that and just explain how we analyze the breeding bird survey data. We used Bird Conservation Region 11, which is that brown that goes from northern Montana through eastern Dakotas into Minnesota. We looked at the breeding bird survey results for that entire bird conservation region, as well as the entire state of Minnesota, and then also just the Minnesota portion of BCR 11. So that bit of red, which really matches the region that we have our 40 SPICE sites. So that's kind of like the closest regional match with the breeding bird survey data. Look at my time, I'm doing okay. So, and just to remind you, for those 5 zones, zone 1 is in the north, and then they go numerical order down to zone 5 in the south, as I step through some of these bird slides. So I'll start with bobolink. And bobolink, on our SPICE sites, we saw slight indication of decline. These are hierarchical, Bayesian hierarchical models, applied similar methods for both the breeding bird survey data as well as the SPICE data. Same time period, so even though breeding bird survey goes back to the late 1960s, we used this 2008 to 2023 for both what we have for the SPICE and then the breeding bird survey data, so it's the same time period. And so this rightmost graph, the 40 SPICE sites, all 40 are on the top, and then this is the next one down, is the one that I compare to the most, that Minnesota portion of BCR 11, and then Minnesota wide, and then the entire BCR 11 zone that goes from Montana through to Minnesota. We see that we had probably not really much of an indication of a decline on our SPICE sites compared to the breeding bird survey. Was about a 4% decline in the Minnesota portion of BCR 11. Thank you. And if we look on the left side, we have the top line is actually the same as this SPICE. It says statewide, it's actually the 40 SPICE sites, and then broken out by those 5 zones. Zone 1 in the north, zone 5 in the south, and we see 3 of those zones are pretty much that neutral, not really much of an annual change, decline in abundance. But zone 3, we're seeing about a 7% decline, whereas zone 5, we're actually seeing an increase. And we really just did this analysis by zone and have some ideas why that might be, but still we haven't had a real chance to think through what some of those reasons might be. So now I'm going to have to step through really quickly. I do have a summary slide at the end, but I'll try and do this quickly, given 5 minutes. Clay-colored sparrow, basically in SPICE, we have maybe a slight indication of an increase in the SPICE sites and pretty consistent across the 5 zones. That differs, especially when you look at the Minnesota-wide trends for clay-colored sparrow, which is from BBS, is around minus 3% decline, or 3% decline. And I will say clay-colored sparrow was the most abundant bird species on our SPICE sites. Second most abundant bird species was common yellowthroat, really hovering around no change, not much, no decline or increase, although there is quite a bit of variability by those 5 zones. And something to investigate further. Maybe gives us a chance to think about different ways of approaching the conservation for these species in these different zones. Dick sisal is increasing tremendously in Minnesota. We have about a 10% increase on our spice sites. Breeding bird survey, it's up around 20%. And it's a more southern species for now, but maybe it is actually moving north. We only detected it in at least enough individuals in zones 3, 4, and 5 to analyze the data, and we see the highest increase in zone 3, the further north one. Grasshopper sparrow, prairie obligate, declining pretty similar with breeding bird survey, also pretty similar declines with all 5 of the zones, the spice zones. Henslow sparrow, we really don't have a lot of data. I'm going to skip over that one. LeConte sparrow, probably the one that's the prairie bird that's declining the most, and pretty similar between breeding bird survey results and the spice results, and also fairly consistent across the 5 zones. Red-winged blackbird, not a prairie obligate, seen a lot of declines on the spice sites. Some declines also in the breeding bird survey results, and fairly consistent again in all 5 of the zones. Have some thoughts about that. We can talk about that at another point. I'm going to skip savannah or pheasant for now. Savannah sparrow, very similar declines between spice and breeding bird survey, but there's this interesting north to south. As you go from north to south, the rate of decline increases for Savannah sparrow. So the highest rate of decline are in our southern sites. Sedge wren, I'm going to skip over. I'm going to go with swamp sparrow, pretty common in the wetland inclusions and prairies, pretty stable overall, but there is again an interesting reverse trend from what we saw with the Savannah sparrow, where actually there's an increase in our southern sites and a decrease in the northern sites. And then I'll finish up with western meadowlark, similar between spice and breeding bird survey, and very consistent across all 5 zones. So, in summary, there's a lot of red, which is the message we've been hearing. We are seeing a lot of declines from 2% up to over 10% of these species. There are a few increasers, but there's also a fair amount of similarity between the spice sites and the breeding bird survey routes. And just to put this in perspective, if we look at the blue line in the middle, where if we start a population of 100, after 10 years, that population would decrease by 35% with a 5% annual rate of decline. In 20 years, with that 5% annual rate of decline, looking at that blue line in the middle here, would have lost the population by over 60%. And if you go out to 30 years, that population would have declined over 80%. And even with a 2% decline in 30 years, which really is not a long time when you think about it, that population with a 2% decline would decrease by 35 or 45%. So even a 2% decline is really significant when we're talking about these bird species. So what about landscape context? I'm going to skip through real quickly and just say we really didn't see a very strong effect. We looked at it in 2 different ways. One was just if there was more open habitat surrounding the sites where we were doing the monitoring, did that impact the abundance of birds? And we found 4 bird species, grasshopper sparrow, LeConte sparrow, upland sandpiper, western meadowlark, that had higher abundance when there was more open habitat surrounding the site. We also looked at did that open habitat surrounding that site affect the trends? And only 2 species showed any sort of a moderate effect on the trends. Bobolink, which was maybe neutral, slightly negative. If there was more open habitat, that, say, negative decline was reduced a moderate amount. LeConte sparrow, which was declining dramatically, same thing, a moderate amount. If there was more open habitat, that rate of decline was less. But in general, I was expecting to see stronger signals with the landscape context than what we've found so far. Which brings me to the summary of all this. Repeating this message, that most of our grassland birds are declining at rates of greater than 2% annually. And when we look at these, our best of the best prairies are permanently protected, and compared to our breeding bird survey results, they're fairly similar, indicating that our prairie remnants is not sufficient to reverse these trends. There's declines that vary by regions, and we really want to look into that more. I think there's some, as I mentioned, there's probably some climate change explanations regarding that, but also other potential reasons that could explain some of that. In landscape context, we saw some signals, but really did not have a strong effect on our bird abundances or trends. So really that suggests to me that this decline, and Todd did a great job looking at some of those stressors on the species, there are other factors than just the habitat itself, and that's in that particular site that's impacting the declines. Region-wide populations, or maybe it's during migration, some of those other things, or maybe it's the pesticides. And one of the things I will say, even though I also forgot to mention that these habitats from the vegetation monitoring, as we've analyzed that data, pretty much those habitats are staying in good shape or even improving. And so over time, they're highly diverse. They're quite resilient, actually, and resistant to invasive species coming in. So it's not the habitat that's declining where these birds are at. And with that, I will end, and if there's any time for questions, I'll take some. And thank you.
We do have a little bit of time for just a couple of questions, so if there are some hands out there. I'm close to this one, so we'll...
Thank you. So I wanted to ask if the landscape context didn't have a very large result in Minnesota, do you know examples of other states or maybe in Canada where perhaps there's some larger threshold of a corridor effect or size of the prairie and where you do start to see a turnaround?
Good question. I have not seen any studies. The only study that I haven't looked at for a bit, and if there's any later studies that have come out, but one study was in California where they were looking at, and this is not grassland birds, but it was wetland, seaside shoreland birds, and they compared protected areas to breeding bird survey, and they actually found that the protected areas had a lower rate of change or decline than in the broader breeding bird survey results. So that's one example that was different from what we have, which again sort of suggests that maybe we just don't have, our large embedded sites are just not large and embedded enough in Minnesota. And it would be a good thing to look into, and probably we could use it with eBird data in some spots and the breeding bird survey to examine some of those questions now.
Daren, there's a question here.
Okay.
Question about the Savannah sparrow. I've done 2 breeding bird survey routes for over 40 years, and no. Savannah sparrows have declined faster than any other species that I've looked at, almost to the point of zero when I have 20 to 30 per route before. And it's been particularly noticeable in the last 5 years. So when you say there's been no land use change, for me, one of the routes is up in northeastern Minnesota, and those birds, there's not much land use change there. But in Becker County and Noman County, agricultural policy in terms of conservation, preserved lands, has just declined dramatically. I am just not hearing Savannah sparrows at all, and it's because of the changes in those policies and what the landowners have. They're no longer enrolling. Comment about, as you mentioned, you didn't see any land.
Yeah, well, I didn't see any changes in the habitat of the sites that we were monitoring. The quality of that habitat has stayed pretty consistent. What's surrounding it, yes, definitely. There has been changes, and we did a prairie change analysis back in 2008, and actually, yeah, we're seeing particularly some of those incentive programs are just not enough incentive for people to stay in the CRP programs. It makes makes more financial sense to go back into row crop agriculture. And so definitely that has, the CRP program has been a great benefit to slowing some of these declines, and unfortunately, we have to stay on top of that and incentivize that more.
Do you have any sense of the winter habitat of these grassland birds driving any of these losses?
It definitely could be part of the issue, for sure, and we need to have more of those, the full stage, full life history analyses of these bird species to be looking at what's impacting what is really the main stressor on these. And I don't have any clear answers on that yet, but it certainly could be an issue that's leading to that.
Excellent.
Or at least adding to because we also know we just lack the habitat for these species.
Excellent. Thank you, Daren.
Thank you.